The Winter Road to Seoul. On Sundays, Bill McEnroe sits in the fifth pew from the back at First United Methodist Church of Riverside. John Yoon stands at the pulpit, looking out over the congregation. Every other week, his father, Young Bong Yoon, sits in the front, holding his Bible, face turned up to hear his son's words. They had no idea when they met that they had shared snow and explosions, tanks rumbling down a road, and refugees walking through the ice and mud, Americans guarding the passage for North Koreans in the winter of 1950. Miles of winter road changed the lives of the Yoon family, and 2 inches of leaning forward kept Bill McEnroe alive. Bill McEnroe was 19 years old in July 1950 when he got on the USS Meigs to ship out of San Diego. More than 3,000 Marines and Navy corpsmen sailed on the military transport vessel, and after 2 weeks at sea, they landed at Kobe, Japan, to prepare their tanks for Incheon. Being young, you think you can do anything, McEnroe said. I was gung-ho Semper Fi Marine, ready for the hard charge. I was under 2 sergeants who had survived the Bataan Death March. He was born in Stevensville, Texas, where his family farmed peanuts and raised dairy cows. But both his father and uncle left for the Army. McEnroe ended up in San Diego when he was 12, and he loved to work on engines. We had brand new M26 Pershing tanks, he said, the Cosmoline still on the weapons, they were so new. Cosmoline was a clay-like axle grease used for waterproofing. We loaded them onto the combat ships, and the back end lowered down, the ocean water rushed in, and we floated out and headed to shore. From Incheon landing, by September 15th, McEnroe and his B Company 1st Tank Battalion fought into Seoul with their tanks straddled on railroad tracks and bridges, perched precariously over the rivers and canyons. They survived a firefight at the railroad station in Seoul, and then fought north into Taegu. By November, they had pushed as far as the frigid mountains of Hagaru-ri. It was 10 to 15 degrees below zero. Their instruments froze, and their weapons froze, and the lubricants froze. Even the massive shells loaded into the tanks would not fire. The Marines greased the shells with Procter & Gamble soap sent from America for themselves, and they continued to fight and move. We finally got to Chosin Reservoir, Bill McEnroe said, and set up a base camp. We had 5 tanks, and we headed north from camp on a small road, and then we took fire from the side of the road. His first sergeant, Hopkins, the veteran of World War II, was 6 months from retirement. He was killed. One night, McEnroe saw a North Korean soldier in the snow. Just crawling, he said. His head was like a lollipop. It was just huge, covered with ice. You could see his ears inside the casing of ice. He had a brand new uniform, no shoes. He was about 15 or 16 years old. Young Bong Yoon was 22. He had been a student at a Methodist seminary in Pyongyang, North Korea for 3 years, and in the spring of 1950, he noticed military equipment being sent south on trains. Seminary students like Yoon were targeted by the North Korean government, spied on and often jailed. Yoon's mother had been a very early Christian in North Korea, influenced by Methodist missionaries in the late 1800s. Yoon wanted to be a minister, so he kept a low profile. But after the June invasion of South Korea, it seemed he'd be lucky to survive. He stayed in Pyongyang, trying to avoid the fate of the young soldiers frozen in combat, their bodies lost in the snow, no one to find them until spring. On November 24th, General MacArthur declared that the war was won, but he continued to push the American troops north, toward the border with China. And on November 27th, Mao sent thousands of Chinese troops over that border. The Chinese and North Korean troops began to blow up bridges, and 500,000 Korean civilians began to flee Pyongyang, but the Yoon family waited. We left Hagaru-ri in a long column. I bet we stretched 2 to 3 miles, McEnroe said. Tanks, infantry, artillery. It was the first 10 days of December. We had to stop for days while the engineers rebuilt the bridges. They dropped sections of bridge from the air. But retreat hell. Like Chesty Puller said, we were fighting in a different direction. Alongside them, thousands of refugees were fleeing in the snow, their belongings on their backs, being fired upon by Chinese troops and by their own countrymen. Young Bong Yoon and his older brother hadn't joined the throng yet. Their parents, 2 more brothers and a sister, agonized over the decision. But on January 4th, Yoon's parents told him and his brother to go. "We're too old, we'll slow you down," they said. "Go." Yoon and his brother found an army truck, stopped in Pyongyang, and 2 American soldiers told them to get on. There were 20 people on the truck, and a few army blankets, and the temperature on the road was far below 0. They headed south, into the explosions and the smoke. McEnroe said, "Remember, it's combat." He was sitting at a round table in the church hall in Riverside, California. "There are infantry up on the hills above the road, covering us. We were in the tank moving down the road, and it was slippery and icy, so cold. The civilians were so tired trying to walk, trying to climb onto the tank. It was so chaotic that we didn't know who was who. 5 or 6 Chinese soldiers would mingle in on the road with the Korean civilians and then start shooting." Sitting beside Bill McEnroe, eating pie and drinking church-made coffee, his Korean Bible in a much-handled black leather case, was young Bong Yoon. "We figure they must have passed each other on the road," Yoon's son John said. He is senior pastor at First United Methodist Church of Riverside. "We like to think that Bill was there along the side of that road as they were leaving, that he helped make it possible," John Yoon said. 4 million human beings died there, McEnroe said, half of them civilians. His map was spread on the table, his Marine signet ring on his thick-knuckled finger next to his own piece of pie. Bill McEnroe stayed in Korea for another 2 years as the war continued. One afternoon he drove a wrecker tank, designed to rescue a disabled Pershing, and a mine exploded underneath. 2 of his crew were killed, 2 were injured, and McEnroe kept driving, making it to the medics. "I was in the hospital for 3 weeks," he said. "They left the tank there. I went to see it when I got out. You know, I drove that day because we had minesweepers ahead, and we had to go exactly on the track. We hooked up the tank, turned around, and headed back out on the same route, but the weight of the other tank triggered the mine sensor. That mine was a U.S. Army ammunition box filled with TNT and shrapnel." He leaned forward in the folding chair. "That day, I saw the radio on the door. A piece of metal was embedded in there, like it flew into butter. It had come through the tank and penetrated that radio case. I was leaning forward in the driver's seat, trying to keep us exactly on track and working the gears. If I had leaned back 2 inches, that piece of metal would have gone through my spine." The day he visited the blown-up tank, he posed with a pipe and a jaunty smile. After the war, he received the Purple Heart. Young Bong Yoon made it to Seoul and became a military chaplain for the South Korean Army. He worked for the Korean United Methodist Church, and eventually, in 1953, he found his fiancée, who had fled on that same road on a different day. He thought he'd lost her. They were married, and John Yoon was born in Incheon in 1960. Young Bong Yoon came to Michigan in 1972, founded a Korean Methodist church, and his son and 3 daughters arrived with his wife in 1973. John Yoon became a minister as well, and was assigned to Riverside in 2010. Bill McEnroe led a church breakfast where John Yoon talked about his father's life, and McEnroe realized that the snowy road was one he knew. Christopher Jin Yong Yoon, born in 1990 in Michigan and graduated in 2012 from UCLA, sat beside his grandfather and Bill McEnroe in the church hall. "Haraboji gave me my middle name, right, Dad?" he said. He is the eldest son. He and his brother, Joshua Chang Yong Yoon, will be the only ones to carry on the Yoon name. Yes, he did, John Yoon said. That's tradition. The four men were suddenly quiet, bent over their plates of pie. 3 heads of thick, lustrous black hair, and 1 gleaming pink scalp, fringed with silver.